So welcome to our webinar of the month for Stingray filters. We are speaking tonight with Greg Miller about polarizing filters, why every photographer needs them. By way of introduction, Greg Miller photographs a wide range of subjects from bold and colorful panoramas of dramatic elements of nature to intimate monochromatic artistic nudes with subtle textures and tones. Commercial assignments include projects ranging from the Adirondacks to Chilean Patagonia. Tuxedo Park, The Gift of Nature, featuring over 200 new color landscape photos by Greg, was released in September 2015. His first photo book, The Hudson River, A Great American Treasure, has been honored to be named Bloomsbury Review's Favorite Books of the Year list for 2008. Greg also served as an artist in residence at Acadia National Park in autumn of 2009. His photographs have been featured internationally in publications such as Popular Photography and Imaging, Outside, Backpacker, Black and White Magazine, Photo District News, Europe's Digiphoto Magazine, Hudson Valley, Budget Travel, Inside Out Hudson Valley. He leads private photography workshops and also workshops and photography tours for organizations such as the Center for Photography at Woodstock, Peters Valley School of Craft, National Park Service, Digital Photo Academy, the Adirondack Photography Institute, and Alana State Historic Site. So Greg, it sounds like you are super busy and we are so glad to have you with us tonight.
Yeah, very good. I do stay busy, but that's a good thing. So welcome everybody. Tonight wanted to talk about polarizer filters and why would we want to use one. Singh-Ray did not ask me to do this, but I thought it made sense to talk just a little bit about the different polarizer filter options from Singh-Ray, and importantly, once you own one, how do you use it? How do you use it correctly? There are some mistakes that can happen, and I have some examples of that, so you'll get to see that. And I brought a bunch of example photos where I show the exact same scene with polarization and without. So with that, let's move along. And there we go. So question, why should we use a polarizer? Polarizers can do several things. If you live in a humid area, particularly this time of year, or even in, say, the desert southwest of the US, where you get a lot of sand or fine sand particles in the air, you get haze. Polarizers can eliminate that. There's often scattered light where light's bouncing around from a variety of sources. We have reflection. Sometimes we want reflection, sometimes we don't. And a polarizing filter can reduce all of those. They can reduce haze, can reduce scattered light, can reduce reflections. And while it's doing that, it can increase contrast and increase color saturation, and also enhanced rainbows, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, I think when most people think about polarizer filters, they think of enhancing the sky, which we have a photo here with a really nice sky in it. But for me, that's not the main reason I use a polarizer. And I do keep a polarizer on my two most used lenses all the time, or virtually all the time. And that's because as a landscape photographer, there's almost always foliage or other reflective things in the scene. And almost all foliage has at least a little bit of like a waxy sheen on the leaf, which reflects light. And if it's a gray overcast day, you're going to see a gray reflection off the foliage. If it's a blue sky day, you're going to get a blue reflection off the foliage, and that's going to diminish the green, or in the autumn, the nice yellows and reds and oranges. And so I keep a polarizer filter on my lenses as a rule and rarely take them off. And primarily that's for foliage and allow the reflection. If I choose not to want it, which is most of the time, to eliminate that reflection. So here's the same scene with the polarizer. I'm going to talk a lot tonight about with a polarizer and without. And when I say without the polarizer, it doesn't mean I'm taking the polarizer filter off. It means I'm rotating the polarizer so it has a minimum effect, which is pretty similar to not having a polarizer filter on at all. So here we have the scene. I really love the sky here, but if I rotate the polarizer 90 degrees, which minimizes the effect of polarization, you can see the blue sky isn't nearly as blue. The difference in contrast between the blue sky and the white or slightly warm clouds is much different. Two totally different photos. And if you don't use a polarizer, this is what you would get with this scene. If you do use a polarizer, this is what you can get instead. And I think that's a pretty dramatic difference. And that's why most people think about polarizers is to help enhance the skies. But we'll look at a lot of examples where it's not all about the sky. So here's a typical landscape scene, lots of foliage. And I mentioned almost all foliage is reflective to a little degree. The leaves are going to reflect whatever the sky is in most cases. And the polarizer can reduce or eliminate that reflection. So here's the scene with the polarizer in use. If I eliminate the polarizer, this is what we get. So particularly look at the leaves in the foreground center. So that's with the polarizer working for me. And this is without the polarizer working for me. And the foliage is reflecting the sky. This happened to be a blue sky day. And it looks more like it's reflecting gray, but big difference between using the polarizer. The colors are much more saturated. The reflection off the foliage is gone. The contrast is better. Just a better scene overall with the polarizer on. A lot of people are always curious about gear, so I thought I'd talk very quickly about the gear I use. My primary camera is a Nikon D850, and I have more lenses than this, but the core foundation of what I use is a Nikkor 14-24, a 24-70, and a 70-200. The 24-70 and 70-200 have a Singh-Ray polarizer filter on them almost all the time, 99% of the time. The Stingray polarizers I use are what Singh-Ray calls the LB lighter, brighter neutral polarizers. We'll talk about some other options and why you might want them. And I also happen to have a variety of Stingray graduated neutral density filters. We won't talk about those today, but my favorite graduated neutral density is the Darrell Benson reverse, which means the density part of the graduated neutral density happens at the transition line from clear to density, and then it lessens towards the top. And that's perfect for when you're shooting into the sun, when the sun's low on the horizon. The lowest part of the sky happens to be the brightest, and that's where you need the density. So the Darrell Benson reverse gives me that. If you're shooting away from the sun, then the Galen Roll standard neutral density filters can work better. If I only had the money to buy one, it would definitely be the Darrell Benson reverse. And it's probably worth noting with the graduated neutral densities, I hand hold those. I do not use a filter holder. I like to be fast. I don't like the hassle of putting on adapters and adapter rings and sliding the filter in place. It's just so much faster to just hold one up against my lens with my hand. And I can also move it during the exposure and adjust the transition from clear to density.
Now, do you use a lens hood with the polarizing filter?
Nah, it's pretty difficult for me, like, with my fingers are probably a little fatter than most people's, and getting my fingers in there to rotate, polarizer filter, the key is to rotate the outer ring to adjust how much polarization you have, and to get my fingers inside that with a lens hood, it's just too difficult for me. But I definitely suggest lens hoods are a good thing. So for the people who have them and prefer to use them, and can get their fingers in there and operate the polarizer, I definitely would still recommend doing that. So I consider the polarizer filter the most important filter you can buy. And while we're looking at this, is the scene we're looking at is nighttime with the moon up in the sky. And just because the sun isn't up doesn't mean the polarizer stops working. The moon's pretty bright. It's one stop less bright than the sun. So if you need polarization during the day, you need it at night as well. So the reason I think the polarizer is really important, one of the key reasons, is it's one of the few filters where you cannot reproduce the effect digitally. So we looked at the photo with the leaves reflecting the sky. The only way to get rid of that in post-production, whether it's Lightroom or Photoshop or any other tool, would be to clone in green leaves, and you're basically making it up at that point. Once you have a photo with gray or blue or white shining off a leaf, it's there, and you're only going to be able to correct that by cloning in and sort of making it up. Whereas if you have the polarizer in the field, it just works and there's zero post-production required. Even though I use a polarizer almost always, you still need to have good light when you're making a photo. There aren't any filters that are going to compensate for bad light. And real quickly, how I define good light is light has three primary qualities. The color, so we have neutral midday light, we have the golden hour when the sun's up just above the horizon, we have the blue hour where the sun's below the horizon. The colors are important, and if you're going to shoot at midday, you're going to miss those colors. So you have color, intensity, how contrasty is the light, that's still important, and the direction of the light still important. And as landscape photographers like me, the light having a direction from low on the horizon typically is better than midday light shining straight down. So polarizer filter is great. It can do really good stuff for us, but it cannot compensate for bad light. And as I mentioned,
do you ever use auto ISO with the polarizer?
So auto ISO is going to raise your ISO when the light's low enough that you might have trouble hand holding the photo or hand holding the camera and still have a sharp image. So I don't see the polarizer changing that, other than a polarizer is going to reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor. So it might change a scene where you can comfortably handhold, still have a sharp image, to maybe not quite being able to do that handheld. I'm a huge proponent of shooting off a tripod. So me personally, I don't use auto ISO because I'm on a tripod, nothing in the scene's moving unless it's windy or there's an animal or a person. So if my shutter speed changes from 1/25 of a second to 1/12 of a second, it doesn't change anything for me. If you're hand holding and you're shooting in low light, then auto ISO probably makes sense to make sure that you're always shooting at a shutter speed that allows you to still get a sharp image and not have any photographer movement involved.
And then would you use a polarizer filter with a long lens, like a drop-in filter for Nikon 600mm or 200 to 400mm?
I do. So I didn't mention it as one of my core lenses, but I have a Sigma 150 to 600mm lens, and it has a polarizer on it. And it stays on most of the time. Every now and then, with some really bad environmental conditions at very long telephoto lengths, you can get some weird stuff happening, but I prefer to have a polarizer on it. And as I mentioned before, on my 24 to 70 and 70 to 200 lenses, those are the two lenses I use probably close to 90% of the time. They have a Stingray polarizer on them, and it rarely comes off. I'll talk about reasons I might take it off, but they're on there. And that's what I think gives me the best images.
Well, and that's the beauty of the polarizer too. If you don't want the polarization, you turn it and you don't have the polarization.
Absolutely. So we saw a couple examples of with and without polarization, and without really meant I rotated the filter so it had minimum effect. And I have about 20 images I'm going to show later with and without polarization. It's simply as fast as rotating the filter 90 degrees. And I find, so I want the polarizer on most of the time. There's almost always reflective things in the scene, particularly foliage, but there are many other things that are reflective. And I want control over whether I want the reflection to be there or I want to remove it. You know, think about wet rocks, they're reflective. Water is reflective. And sometimes I want the reflection, sometimes I don't. And I can control how much reflection I have simply by rotating the filter 90 degrees. And in the rare occasion that I don't want the polarizer on, it's way faster to just unscrew it and take it off than to not have it on and then really wish I had it, and then digging through my camera bag to find the polarizer and screw it on. And you know, if you're clumsy like me, it takes a few tries to get it screwed on, you know, with the threads just right and not cross-threaded. That takes time. And a lot of times in landscape photos, but even indoor photos, portraits, if you're using it, you can lose your image in a matter of seconds. So to me, it's a difference between getting the image and not getting the image. And it takes just a second or two to take it off, but it could take many seconds to find the filter. Even if it's in my pocket, I've got to reach in my pocket, pull it out, get it threaded on, then rotate it. So I just found for myself, it's just way better to keep it on. I almost always want it. In the rare cases where I don't, it's pretty fast to take it off.
So by leaving your polarizer on all the time when you're not using it, does the extra glass degrade the image quality at all?
Well, that's one of the reasons I really like Stingray. It's one of the best brands in terms of image quality and glass quality. And yeah, any glass you put in front is going to do a little degradation, but I find the benefits I get from having a polarizer far outweigh any image degradation. And to be honest, in the real world, I can't think of a case where I'm editing a photo and think, oh, wow, my polarizer filter degraded the image quality because the glass wasn't good enough. It's never happened. And, you know, Stingray filters are not the cheapest out there, but particularly with polarizers, a cheap filter is going to cause a lot of problems. So the good thing with Stingrays, yeah, they cost a little more, but you know, the quality of the glass in that filter is really good. And in a polarizer filter, I'm going to talk about how they're constructed. You have an extra element in the polarizer filter, which makes it even more important to use a high quality brand like Stingray.
And then someone asked, what's the difference between a circular and a linear polarizer? I'm going to put some links in the chat for you to see some examples of some polarizers and some examples of our ND filters, which I think is what he means by linear, the graduated filters.
Yeah, so there is such a thing as a linear polarizer. Almost all quality polarizers you're going to buy today are circular polarizers. But many years ago, before autofocus, auto exposure, linear polarizers were more common. But once autofocus and auto exposure came in, our cameras don't work with a linear polarizer. They only work with a circular polarizer. But that's been so many years that I can't think of anybody that intentionally is selling a linear polarizer, other than maybe if somebody's trying to get away with a quick one on eBay or someplace like that. So I don't worry about it anymore, because I'm almost 100% sure if you buy a polarizer from Singh-Ray, there's zero chance it's going to be a linear polarizer. You don't want one because your autofocus isn't going to work, but you're not going to get one from Stingray. So here, Stingray has a variety of polarizers. The ones I use on my cameras are LB, and the LB stands for lighter, brighter. And Stingray polarizers, compared to almost every other polarizer out there, typical historical polarizers reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor or film by 2 stops. And in low light situations, if you're hand holding, that can be a problem. They'll lose 2 stops of light. But Stingray LB polarizers only lose about 1 stop and 1/3. So you can have a faster shutter speed with a Stingray LB polarizer than almost any other polarizer you would get from other brands. So I think that's all Stingray's even offering anymore, is the lighter, brighter. I prefer the neutral. So with cheap polarizers, you're going to get weird color things happening. The cheaper polarizing material that's used in the lens can cause color cast to happen, but with the Stingray, it's going to be neutral, which I prefer. But Stingray also offers their warming polarizer, which adds just a little bit of warmth to every photo. So warm colors are going to be like this scene with the yellows and oranges. Those are warm colors, and a lot of really good, household name photographers love that. They love a slightly warm image. My preference is for neutral, because I'm a big fan of including both warm colors and cool colors in a scene like this one, where you have the warm yellows and oranges, but we also have the cool blues and purples. And I don't want to lose the coolness in the colors that are naturally cool. And I also know by shooting in RAW format as opposed to JPEG, if I decide my color balance needs to change a little bit in the RAW conversion, I can do that without any negative implications to it. So I personally prefer the neutral. Many really good photographers prefer warming filters. It just comes down to taste. Both are perfectly fine. It just comes down to taste for color. Stingray has a combo filter. So Stingray has a color enhancing filter, and they've added that as an option to the polarizing filter. So not only do you get polarization, you also get color enhancement. So colors like green and blue are a little more saturated than they would be without it. And with the color combo, a little bit of warmth. With the infused neutral polarizer, it has that enhanced color saturation, but without the warmth. So pretty much whatever your personal taste is for warming or not warming, and in or not with a combination of a polarizer, you have those options. So they're basically giving you anything you might want. If you haven't experimented with warming filters, maybe it's best to buy Stingray's warming filter and give that a shot to see if you like it or not. They're a little less expensive than a polarizer filter.
So with the warming or color combo results, can those effects be created in Photoshop with a basic neutral polarizer?
I'm sorry, say the question again.
If you have the warming or color combo polarizer, can you duplicate those effects in Photoshop if you just had the regular polarizer?
Yeah, that's really my thinking. So like with this image, if I was in the raw conversion process and I decided I wanted those cool colors to be a little warmer, in the raw conversion, we have sliders for color, temperature, and tint that, with the temperature slider, we can slide it right and get more warmth out of it. So for my taste, that's how I would do it as opposed to using the warming filter. But if you use the warming polarizer and you decide it was too warm, you can do the opposite. So as long as you're shooting raw, it really doesn't matter. I just find for myself, a lot of my images juxtapose warm colors against cool colors, and I want those cool colors for a reason, but that's just me.
I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum. I tend to warm up every photo I take. So when I have a warming polarizer, I can save that little step later. But it's a preference thing because I shoot a lot and I want them all warmer. It's just my preference.
Yep, definitely a personal preference, and with whatever you're using, as long as you're shooting it raw, it's pretty simple to correct for it if you decide you wished you had the other one. Or you can, if you really know what you want, you can have both filters and switch them. So let's talk about construction and quality of filters, because it's really important with polarizers, more important than almost any other type of filter. A good polarizing filter is difficult to manufacture well. It's the hardest one to make. And part of that is because there's really three elements to it. It's not just a piece of glass. There's two pieces of glass that sandwich what's called a polarizing foil. So you have this polarizing filter, which screens out light rays that are oriented in different directions. And you have to sandwich that between two pieces of glass. So if you start out with a cheap piece of polarizing filter, you're going to get color cast, you're going to get weird banding effects, particularly noticeable in the sky. If they aren't laminated well, they can delaminate. If it gets wet and it's not laminated, if the whole stack isn't laminated well together, water can get in between and cause problems. So polarizing filters cost more because they're more difficult to manufacture. And yes, you can buy a $30 polarizer filter, but you're going to get cheap elements. The manufacturing is going to be cheap, and you're going to end up with problems with color cast, problems with banding in the sky, and problems with getting moisture in between and having delamination problems. So I think, just like I think with tripods, you can buy a cheap tripod and then you're going to hate it, and then you're going to buy a more expensive tripod. Just don't waste your money on the cheap stuff, even however painful it is to spend a lot of money on a polarizer filter or a tripod. It's just cheaper in the long run to do it right in the first place. Pay money for a good one and you won't regret it. And regarding this, I have a little bit of a horror story. So Michelle mentioned my Tuxedo Park book, which I was shooting for a few years ago, and it was a particularly snowy winter here in the Hudson Valley where I live. And I typically walk around. I have my camera on a tripod. I shoot off a tripod 98% of the time. I walk around with the whole rig over my shoulder. The camera's still on the tripod. The tripod's over my shoulder. I'm walking around. I was tromping through deep snow, getting images for my book. I get back to my car and I noticed my Stingray Polarizer filter was missing, wasn't on my lens anymore. Somehow I managed to lose it. And there's so much snow. I walked around for probably 20 minutes looking for it. I couldn't find it. And so I went home, I ordered a new one to replace it because I can't not have one. And a few times I went back to Tuxedo Park when I was shooting. I thought maybe, as snow melted or the snow plows moved snow around because there are really deep piles of snow alongside the roads, maybe I would find it. I kept looking all winter long and couldn't find it. And then I think it was like April, most of the snow piles were gone. And I went back to that spot. I looked and I found the polarizer. And it had been in one of the deep snow banks and it gradually melted off and finally exposed the filter. So the filter had been in there all winter because I lost it early winter. It was out there being pushed around by the snow plows, going through freeze and thaw cycles the entire winter. It was wet when I found it in the snowbank. I took it home, dried it off, and guess what? It was still good as new. No way that would have happened with a cheaper filter.
That's crazy.
So,
A couple of notes on manufacturing, because we've had a couple of questions too. I've actually been to the Stingray offices, and they hand make these filters in small batches, and then they inspect them one by one, like a human eye actually inspects them. And so because of their size, someone had asked if we make a polarizer for a Nikon 180 to 400. It's not something that's on the website, but because of the way Stingray manufactures their filters in small batches like that, if you need a one-off filter, give us a call, and chances are we can get it done for cheaper than you think. So that's something totally within Stingray's capabilities. So definitely reach out for that. And then someone asked, how can you insure against buying a counterfeit Stingray on the used market? So the current filters have the Stingray name etched into the rings. If the filter is older than 2010, it would have been labeled, it wouldn't be etched. And if you are considering buying something from eBay or wherever, send us a picture of it and we can help you verify that that is in fact a real Stingray filter.
that's awesome. So, how now that you've decided to buy one or you already have one, how do you use it? So for starters, I have what I call the thumb rule. And, I mentioned before quality of light, it's a little different if you're shooting in the middle of the day where the sun's overhead. But hopefully the landscape photographers out there are shooting in the good light towards the edges of the day. The sun's going to be low on the horizon. So if you point your finger, your index finger right at the sun and stick your thumb up at it, so it makes an L or 90 degree, the polarizer has most effect 90 degrees away from the direction of the sun. So now your thumb is at 90 degrees. So if you rotate your thumb to the left, so now it's pointing at the horizon, that spot on the horizon where the thumb's pointing at is going to be maximum polarization effect. If you rotate your thumb all the way back to the right, so it's now pointing at the horizon to the right of the sun, that's another place where you're going to have maximum polarization. So looking at the sun or directly away from the sun where the sun's behind you, you'll have minimum effect. Now, it doesn't mean there's no effect because a lot of times we have scattered light. If it just rained and there's raindrops still in the air and you're looking at the sun, those raindrops are going to scatter the light, and the polarizer can help reduce that scattered light and bring out true colors. So really any kind of haze, even if you're looking at the sun, a polarizer can still help. It's just going to help the most at a 90-degree to the right or to the left of looking directly at the sun. There is an exception to that, which is rainbows. And rainbows form 100 degrees or directly opposite of the sun. So if it's late in the day, sun's in the west, and it just rained and the sun comes out, you turn around and look to the east, that's where the rainbows are going to be. And a polarizer can enhance the colors, the saturation of the colors in the rainbow by eliminating the scattered light, which allows the actual rainbow to be revealed more fully. Or, not that you would want to do this, if you rotate the polarizer 90 degrees from where the rainbow looks the best, the rainbow is going to disappear. You can make that rainbow disappear or come very close to disappearing. So anytime there's a rainbow, even though the rainbow is not, it's 180 degrees, it should have the least effect. I use the polarizer to bring out the true colors of the rainbow, and it's going to look better than the rainbow looks to the naked eye. And a lot of times what you don't even know with the naked eye is there's a double rainbow. You can see the primary rainbow, you can't see the second rainbow, but by using your polarizer and enhancing the colors of the rainbow, you're going to see both, and you might not see it with the naked eye. So to use the polarizer, once you screw it onto your lens, you simply rotate the polarizer, and looking through the viewfinder, you're going to be able to see reflections go away, and then rotate some more, you'll see the reflections come back. You don't even have to put the polarizer on your lens. If you're just wondering if the polarizer is going to help you in a specific scene, you can hold the polarizer up in front of your eye, look through the polarizing filter and rotate it with your hand, and you'll be able to see the effect of the polarizer. And if you see that it's helping, then you can screw it onto the lens and use it. But again, for me, the polarizer almost always helps, even if just a little. So I just keep it on. And then when I have my composition in place, I rotate the polarizing filter to see what effect it has and where I like it the most. Sometimes I want a reflection, sometimes I don't. And just by rotating the filter, I can achieve either one.
We had a tip from the audience. Always turn it clockwise. I lost mine in a canyon when I accidentally went the other direction and unscrewed it accidentally. So
yeah, very good
start
tip.
clockwise.
Very good tip. So when you're looking through the viewfinder, if you're holding the polarizer in your hand and just looking through it, look for the reflections, look for contrast to increase or decrease, watch for haze to disappear, or if you're, and optimize it to what looks best to you. And with all of those reflections, contrast, haze, they can all be good for your photo, they can all be bad. It depends on what you're shooting and what you like. And with the polarizer on, you can achieve any look that you're looking for. Now, this is really important because our cameras do not see the way the human eye sees. And what typically happens is you can look, this problem goes away with a mirrorless camera where you're actually looking at a LCD screen, whereas with a traditional DSLR or SLR camera, you're looking through an optical viewfinder. When you're looking through an optical viewfinder, what you see is not what the camera is going to give you with the polarizer filter. Typically, you end up with more polarization than what your human eye sees. And it takes a little time to get used to that and get a feel for it. But always, if you just make your photo or go to live view, show the image on your LCD screen, you can see the actual effect of the photo. So I recommend if you're getting used to a polarizer, always confirm it with an LCD screen to make sure. The worst thing that typically happens is overpolarization. I'm going to have some examples of that, and it's an ugly look, and it's hard to fix in Photoshop, sometimes impossible. So it's something to be aware of. And it's most common with wide angle lenses.
And then do you set your polarizer before setting your shutter f-stop or after?
My process is I frame the scene. I'm on a tripod, so I can do that. It's not going to move. Next, I adjust the polarization. And then after that, only after that, then I determine my exposure, because with polarization and changing the amount of polarization, you're letting more or less light through the lens back to the sensor. And so depending on how the polarizer is oriented, you're going to get more or less light. So that will impact your exposure. So let's talk about the most common mistakes made by having a polarizer on. Number one is, particularly Americans, more is always better, right? But not with polarizers. Sometimes the best is somewhere in between. So it isn't always a case of rotate the polarizer till you get maximum effect or least amount of effect. Sometimes it's in between there. And that's the nice thing of polarizer, is you have the two extremes, but you have the full spectrum in between to choose from. So don't automatically just rotate it to the maximum and assume that's the best, because it isn't always. Particularly with wide angle lenses where you have, so we talked about the 90-degree rule, maximum polarization 90 degrees from the sun, minimum polarization looking directly at the sun or directly away from it. If you have a wide angle lens that covers typically more than 90 degrees, you're going to get the minimum and the maximum in some frames, depending on which direction you're pointing. And you can get skies that go from very dark blue to very light blue, and it's not natural. It doesn't really happen often in nature. And once you see it, it's like, okay, this person wasn't paying attention. So be particularly careful with wide angle lenses, and heavy polarization with a wide angle lens in a scene that includes a sky is almost always going to be problematic. And because of that extra piece of glass in front of your lens, if the sun's in the frame or close to being in the frame, you can get more lens flare than you would without. So this is the number one reason I take my polarizer off, is if I'm including the sun in my frame. And sometimes I like lens flare, so it can be a good thing, but sometimes I don't want the lens flare. And in those cases, I'll use my depth of field preview to see whether I have lens flare, or I can take a test shot, look on the LCD to see if it's there. And that's typically what I'll do. And if I see flare and I don't like it, then I'll unscrew the polarizer and take it off temporarily. So not a lot of negatives.
So is there a way to avoid sky color bands with the polarizer on a wide angle lens?
Yeah, I'm actually going to show you at least one example where I've got the bands and then I changed the orientation of the polarizer to eliminate it. So it's basically rotating the filter to achieve what you're trying to do and without getting that effect. And on very rare occasions, I might blend. I'll shoot the photo twice, once with polarization, once without, and then I'll blend it in Photoshop. I'll use the two images and blend in the sections of each photo that I want. So, what would be common is lots of light reflecting off of foliage and using the polarizer to limit that. But then with a wide angle lens, if it's a blue sky day, you might get that banding in the sky. So I could use minimum polarization for the shot with the sky and use the sky portion in Photoshop and blend in the foliage photo for the part, where there's foliage, and get the best of both worlds. I don't do that a lot. It's typically not necessary, but if it's a killer shot and I'm not liking the way the sky looks, then I'll do that. And one of the tricks I use, because if you're shooting a lot, then you get back home or your studio and you can't remember when you did that. So I always shoot dark frames before and after that. So I'll cover my lens with my hand. I'll tip the shutter so I get a black frame, and then I'll shoot my shots with polarization without, and then I shoot another dark frame. And when I see that, when I'm editing, it's like, I know I did that. I know I did something special. I also do the same thing if I'm shooting a panorama where I have 2 or more photos that I want to blend into a panorama. I'll do the same thing as a reminder to myself, particularly if you're on, like I just got home from a 10-day photo trip, and if I don't edit until I get home, it's impossible to remember all those things. So shooting a black frame helps me remember what I did. So let's look at some sample photos. And this scene, this is on a beach in Maine, and everything in this frame is wet. And everything in the frame, it was late in the day, everything was reflecting the sky. So we have wet seaweed, wet small rocks, wet big boulder with lots of stuff on it. All of that was reflecting sky. And I had my polarizer on the lens already. So simply by framing up the shot and then rotating my polarizer up to 90 degrees, it eliminated all the reflections. Unfortunately, in this one, I wasn't smart enough to shoot a second frame to show you what it looked like, but I think you can probably imagine. Every shot after this will have a with and without polarization. So even in fog, polarizer filters can help, because fog is just water droplets in the air. And what happens when sunlight hits water droplets? It starts scattering light everywhere. So foggy scenes have scattered light. The scene can look like it has a color cast, but I'm going to show you, this is the shot with polarization. Here's the shot without. 2 very different looks to this. And you might prefer one over the other, but having the polarizer gives you the option to use either of these scenes. I think they're both useful and could work for certain scenarios, but notice this scene, the greens are much cooler. In this scene, the greens are really washed out from more of the fog showing through. So the color changes, the amount of fog that you see changes. Very different look depending on how the polarizer is oriented. Here's a scene from Venice, Italy. And so we have, this will be a little subtle in spots, but clearly we have a reflection on the canal, but there's also reflections off the stucco parts of the building. There's reflections off the brick buildings. This happens to be with polarization. So those reflections, I'm sorry, this is without. Here's with polarization. Notice the water at the bottom. We eliminate a lot of that. So Venice, the actual watercolor is green. So if your intention is to show the true watercolor, then the polarizer makes sense. Or if your intention is to show the beautiful reflections of the sky and the cloud, then minimizing polarization makes sense. Either is right. And if you don't know when you're shooting, especially with digital, since it doesn't cost anything to shoot extra frames, shoot it both ways. And you don't have to decide when you're shooting. A lot of times, if I'm not sure, I'll shoot it both ways. And then I decide later when I have the luxury of sitting in my studio and mulling it over, and I don't have the pressure of being there. But even look at the brick building on the left. It's a little subtle, but there's clearly a difference between how much light's reflecting off the brick and the color of the brick. and the contrast between the colors on the brick. Also notice the boat covers because they're reflecting light, particularly the boat on the right with the brown cover. There, it's a little subtle, but you can see, you can control how much reflection of the boat cover happens. Doesn't have to be landscape. So in Venice, I was photographing architecture too. And you'll notice, so this scene has various kinds of metal, but also paint or stained wood. All of that is reflective. So this is minimum polarization. And that's with a lot of polarization, eliminating those reflections. I'll show a few of these. So here we have a metallic figurine. And a lot of times you'll hear that polarizers don't work on reflections off of metal. It's not quite true. And if you notice where the reflection is, it moves. So with polarization, you see more reflection sort of on the sides of the figure, where without it, it's more centered. But also look at the paint on the door. So I can eliminate the reflection, I can include the reflection, and I could choose either one. What's important to know is that you are in control of that. And here's the last one. This one shows more. So I eliminated most reflection off the metal figurine in the middle, but notice without it. So we get more reflection, and the reflection moves. So in this one, we get right in the center of the figure in the forehead, we get blue from the door. Whoops. But, all right, technical difficulties here. I'm not going to get to show that, but I'm going to try it one more time. There we go. See the blue in the forehead, and then it goes away for the most part, just depending on the orientation of the polarizer. So here again, we can control how much reflection we see, particularly on the water. So I can reveal the green water of the canal, or I can reveal the reflections. It's my choice. And so here we have tiles and reflective walls. The tiles are highly reflective. So I've eliminated a lot of the reflection off the tiles and the wall, and I can let reflections through. Two pretty different photos just by rotating the polarizer no more than 90 degrees. And just one more with water. So there's a lot of reflection happening. Also look at the light on the drainage pipe in the center. So I can make the reflections go away and reveal the green water. Whoops. Sorry. Or I can choose to keep the reflections and hide the water. But notice again, the drain pipe, very different look just by rotating the polarizer. And here's reflections on the water, but also the lily pads. Notice the lily pads are very green and true to life color, but they're very reflective because they're wet. So without polarization, I get more reflection on the water, but look at the difference in the lily pads. It's quite dramatic. So here's a case where I like the green of the lily pads, but I also like the reflections without polarization up above the lily pad. So here's a case where I might blend the two photos and keep the lily pads from this photo and the reflections from this version of the same photo. So now we're in California. This is Alabama Hills. Here's a sky shot. And also, so you'll notice the sky changes, but notice the arch on the left and the color saturation that changes when I change polarization. So the sky's very obviously changing. The color of the sky is changing. Whoops. But also notice the arch, the orangish color of the arch. It's much more saturated with eliminating the reflection by using the polarizer. Also notice the tall mountains in the distance have more of a blue cast. So when I polarize and remove the reflection and the haze, the mountains are more true to their true color, as opposed to without. They have a bluish cast from the skylight. Here's the same scene without the sky. And in this one, notice the saturation of the rocks and the arch in the foreground, but more importantly, notice the mountains in the distance. So this is without the polarizer. It's much more hazy in the background. There's less contrast, and it's more of a cool color from the skylight versus with the polarizer. It's a much more warm scene. There's more, the colors, the warm colors are much more saturated and rich, and the background is much more clear. It's not hazy, and doesn't have a cool color cast. Even just sky shots. So this is with polarization and without polarization, simply by rotating the polarizing filter 90 degrees. This is maximum polarization and minimum polarization. You might like either shot, but again, it's your choice. With the polarizer, you get to have both choices. Without the polarizer, that's what you get. And you may like that, you may not. Look how dramatic the color of the sky changes from a deeper blue to a more cyan, just from the polarizer. Also notice with polarization, the detail in the moon is much more pronounced than with minimum polarization. So here's what it looks like when you over polarize with a wide angle lens. Look at the sky in the center. Look at the deepness of the blue compared to the sky on the left. It's a dramatic change in the color and the luminosity of the blue, and that's just not normal. And it doesn't look good. Once you've seen it, you notice in somebody else's photo, it doesn't look good. So here's a case where maximum polarization was not good. It hurt the image, but if you look at the grass in the foreground and the trees on the hillside, they look pretty good. And I needed a happy medium, which is this. So this is sort of halfway polarization, not all the way minimized, not all the way maximized. So I don't have the luminosity banding in the sky, but I still have pretty good looking grass and trees. So you have to look out when you're using a wide angle lens and the sky's in the scene. You need to be very careful about not doing the overpolarization. And here's where it can look perfectly fine through an optical viewfinder. Then you look on the LCD screen and it looks awful like this. So here's the scene. We have sky, we have ocean, and we have paint and painted wood, all reflective. And I'm sort of giving you both extremes here. So this is with maximum polarization. We're eliminating reflections to the highest degree here. and then minimum polarization. So it's most noticeable because you can see this, the sun's almost in the frame on the left, where we don't have a lot of polarization happening there. That's where it's going to be minimum. But notice the shutters on the building. Quite a bit of difference. And again, you might prefer one over the other. It doesn't really matter, but you have the choice when you use a polarizer. You can experiment. You don't have a polarizer, then you're going to get one option. And here we are at Anza Borrega State Park in California, Southern California. And this is without polarization. Notice the mountains in the background have a blue color cast. There's very low contrast back there. The little butte down in the bottom left, not a lot of contrast, but with polarization, we get really rich, warm colors, more contrast, less haze, the blue skylight's eliminated. And again, you might like one version over the other, but with the polarizer, you get to choose. You get to choose. Without a polarizer, you're stuck with that. And you may or may not like that. Here we have sky, clouds, and haze. So the mountains in the middle, I have the true color showing through without polarization. They're less contrasty, more blue from blue skylight. So very different image by having the polarizer or not having it. And this one, notice the road. So this isn't even a paved road. This is a dirt road without polarization, with polarization. Very different scene. If it's asphalt, then the change is even more dramatic. Asphalt's very reflective, especially if after rain. And a lot of times a real deep, rich black asphalt road really looks nice, and you're just not going to get that without a polarizer. Another case, less contrast, more blue, the farther out. So we can choose to have warm, deep, rich, saturated colors with contrast, or less contrast and more skylight and more haze. Same situation here. I think this is the last one. So again, look at the haze without. We've got haze, we've got blue skylight. More contrast, warmer with the polarizer. All right, so I'm open to questions at this point.
I've got a few I've been holding on to.
I just want to do a little bit of plug with my social media here. I'm working on my 4th book being published on Venice, Italy. And I'm talking with a specific publisher right now. So as with any photo book these days, it's almost always the case where the photographer is asked to help finance the printing of the book by pre-selling books. So at some point on my social media, I'm going to start asking for help from everybody to pre-purchase books. So if you're at all interested in some really cool photos of Venice, Italy, then appreciate it if you make a note of my social media pages and keep an eye on it and pitch over. I'm ready for questions.
All right. Someone asked early on, is the Sigma 150 to 600 sharp?
I found it to be a really, really good lens. I have the sport version, which is more expensive, built a little better, performs a little better than the other version, which I forget the name of it, starts with a C, but I found it to be quite a good lens. I bought it for one of my books where I needed to shoot wildlife, especially eagles, and it did the job.
And then two related questions. Would you combine a polarizer with an ND graduated filter, or should you remove it when you use those?
Perfectly fine to combine them. So the normal configuration is to have the polarizer on closest to the lens, attached to the lens, and then use the graduated neutral density. So in my case, the polarizer is already on. I'll hand hold the graduated neutral density in front of the polarizer and adjust it. And so I do that a lot. The only time that's particularly when the GNDs and the polarizer are both a real good quality filter like Stingray, and that's what I use. I don't end up with any problems. If they're lower quality, then the more cheap pieces of glass you get in front of your lens, the worse. I think for me, the only potential problem would be if the sun's in the frame, then adding a GND and a polarizer certainly multiplies the odds of getting flare, which might be good, might not be good, but be aware of it. It's just good to be aware of it, but perfectly acceptable to do that.
And what size graduated ND filters do you prefer?
That's a good question. I use the rectangular ones that the standard size, I guess it would be the Coke and P size, and that works for all of my lenses. Stingray has been very generous because for me, sometimes with the bigger diameter lenses, I'm just holding on to a tiny corner of the GND and it's a little bit sharp. And when I'm holding it for some of my exposures are 30 seconds or a minute, and after holding it by the very end of the corner, it kind of hurts my fingers. So Singh-Ray has been very generous and offered to round off the corners for me. I haven't taken them up on it simply because it hurts me to not have them. Like I have to send them in and I don't like not having them. So I haven't done it yet. But the Coke and P size, which I'm pretty sure is the normal size that you'll see on the Stingray side, are work for me.
And I'm interested in your metering methodology and how or if you incorporate any corrections for the polarizer and to what extent.
So as long as you're using DSLR or equivalent where the metering's in the camera is metering through the polarizer as long as the polarizer's in front of the lens. So there's really no adjustment for that. If you're shooting large format or medium format, we're using a handheld meter, then you would need to adjust for that. So with Stingray LB polarizer, they remove about 1 1/3 stop of light. So you would need to adjust for that. Since I sold off that kind of gear, I'm strictly using DSLRs. I don't adjust at all. There's no reason for, but I will comment that our meters look at the entire scene and want the scene to average out to a medium gray. And when I'm shooting at sunrise or sunset and it's dark, the scene is darker than a medium gray. So, or if it's sunset and most of the frame is sky, which is pretty bright, that's brighter than a medium gray. So, my typical landscape scene at the edges of the day is a little bit of sky with a lot of foreground that's dark. It's not getting any direct sunlight. It's pretty normal for me to underexpose by a stop and a half, even 2 stops, because the meter wants the scene to look like midday, an average gray, and that scene is not that bright. If I'm shooting a sunset, most of the frame is the sky that's being lit up by the sun, then I might have to overexpose, because the meter wants, again, to look like midday. It's going to darken it down so the scene averages out to a medium gray, and the scene's brighter than that. So it's very rare that I shoot at the actual meter reading. More often than not, I'm underexposing compared to what the meter wants.
And how does a polarizer affect starburst?
My take on it is it doesn't in most cases. You know, to get a starburst, we want a wide angle lens and stopped down to f/22 or f/16. So that hole in the aperture is super small, and that's what yields the sunburst. The polarizer isn't going to change either the wideness of the wide angle lens nor the aperture. You know, by having an extra piece of glass, you might get you're more likely to get lens flare, which might be good or might be bad. But other than that, I don't think, in my mind, it won't impact it.
And does it have any impact when shooting black and white? Does it increase contrast?
Yes, it will. So almost all the photos I showed, I mentioned haze and the ability to eliminate haze and increase contrast. So, and the color will change. Typically, it gets a little darker, more saturated. So, you know, removing color from a hazy scene, you're going to have low contrast, and a polarizer is going to eliminate a lot of that haze. So you're going to end up with a black and white photo with more contrast than you would have without it. And a lot of the tones are going to be darker than they would be otherwise.
And do you use a polarizer when you plan to stitch photos for a panorama?
I do, and the reason for that is I do a lot of panoramas, and what really drew me to that is the fact that, let's say you have a mountain range. The mountains are always the furthest thing in the scene, and with a wide angle lens, things that are further away get diminished. And you know, if the photo is about the mountain range, then why would I want to diminish it? And by shooting multiple frames with a telephoto lens, we can maintain the majesty of those mountains, but the breadth of the scene is typically narrower and therefore has less risk of having that luminosity banding in the sky, but it's still certainly possible. So I always will look for that and typically not use full polarization. Maybe I'll use somewhere around half polarization, maybe a little less. And then I always verify on the LCD screen to make sure I'm not seeing that, because that is a real pain. If it happens and it's a shot you really want to keep, to fix that in Photoshop can be really, really, really hard. So, you know, if I'm at 200 millimeters and shooting a 3-frame panorama, it's probably not going to be a problem. But if I'm more like at 70 millimeters and shooting a 10-shot panorama, then yeah, that wide angle problem can still manifest itself.
And then how did you stay so sharp on the moon image at 1/6 of a second? And can you achieve that polarized look with adding contrast in post-production?
So the second question first, it's, you know, if there's a reflection, fixing that in post is really impossible. You can fake it by cloning in fake stuff. Yes, you can always add contrast, but you know, the thing with say you're adding contrast with a curve, the more you increase contrast with a curve or a levels layer or a contrast slider, you're also going to increase perceived saturation, and you're going to change the hues a little bit. And that can be a problem. So I'd rather do it with a polarizer where I eliminate the haze, the contrast comes in, and I haven't artificially introduced extra saturation or cause hue changes by increasing contrast in Photoshop.
And do you set the exposure before or after you polarize? I think we touched on that.
Yeah, we touched on that. Definitely after, depending on how the orientation of the polarizer is, it's going to like when you have minimum polarization, it's basically letting in all the light, including the scattered light. When you start polarizing and eliminating the scattered light, less light is actually getting to the sensor, the camera's sensor. So it's definitely important to get your polarizer oriented the way you want it and then set your exposure after that.
And then someone asked, do you ever have problems with the filter getting stuck on the lens?
It happens. Now, here's another benefit of using a high quality filter like a Stingray is the materials that they use are less prone to stick. When you get sticking of filters is when you have two very different metals. So you have the metal typically on where the threads are on your lens. Then you have the metal of the filter. When they're very different metals, they expand and contract at different rates, and that's where you get the sticking. But a quality filter with like Stingray is using a metal very similar to what the lens
what they're made of. The threads on our filters are aluminum.
Okay. But given that, this is not a Stingray issue, this is a Nikon issue. The 70 to 200 millimeter lens that I have makes it really hard to get the polarizer filter off. It's got like a rubberized coating, and it's hard to turn the filter and not get my finger stuck. So just in case, I bought, these are very cheap, I want to say $5. I bought a filter removal tool. It's basically a rubber coated piece of metal that's round that you can squeeze over the round filter and twist it. And I just keep one of those in my camera bag just in case, just for that lens. I think
one of our past presenters says he actually keeps a rubber band in his bag for the same reason.
That can work too. I've had rubber bands don't age very well. In my experience,
that's true.
When I needed one, it was rotten and broke. So I did that for a long time, and then I bit the bullet and spent $5 on a filter removal wrench.
And do you have any experience with the warming polarizer?
I don't think so. I may have had one like 15, 20 years ago, but I don't have any recent experience or enough memory of it to talk to it.
And have you ever tried the blue and gold combo?
I did, and I think where that's most useful is shooting in the middle of the day. And I don't do that because going back to the three qualities of light, color, intensity, and direction. Direction is just not good for most of the scenes I want to shoot in the middle of the day, and that's where the blue and gold polarizer is at its best. So if you're somebody that wants to extend the hours you can shoot into the middle of the day, then it's probably a really good option. But it just wasn't. It's a personal taste thing. It wasn't. Well, I owned one, and I probably still have one in a drawer somewhere, but it's just not of interest to me personally. But that's why Stingray makes them, because we're all different and some people love them. I think Tony Sweet really loves his.
And then will a polarizer work with an IR filter?
Ew, good question. I'm certainly no expert on infrared. So my guess is it should work just as well, but I'm sure there's going to be an infrared expert out there that says, no, it won't. So I don't know.
And do you ever use step-up rings with the filter?
I think that's a great way to go when you have a limited budget, but you want it. It's a great option to buy a polarizer that fits your biggest diameter lens and then buy step down rings so you can use that same filter on your other lenses. For me personally, since I just want a polarizer on my lenses all the time, I have, so the Sigma 150 to 600 has a huge front element. So I have a dedicated polarizer for that, and I have a dedicated polarizer for my other lens. I just spent the money. It's like when I'm out on assignment, I don't have the luxury of missing a shot. So it was worth it to me for that reason to spend the money and just put one on every lens and never have to stress over whether I'm gonna not get a shot because it needed a polarizer and I didn't have enough time to get it off another lens and put it on this lens. But certainly most of us have budget constraints and these are not the cheapest things that we can buy. So I certainly think it makes a lot of sense for people who can only afford one, buy one for your biggest lens, and the step down rings are pretty inexpensive and that allows that one filter to work on all your filters. I forgot to mention that Stingray also makes regular mount and thin mount polarizers. So for my 24 to 70 lens, I use the thin mount because there's less chance of that, the filter thread sticking out and vignetting wide angle shots. So I have a thin mount on that. I have a regular mount on my 70 to 200.
So is there any way to avoid, what do you do with like a wide lens when it shows the filter in the corners of the pic? Is there anything you can do?
So a couple options. Go with Stingray's thin mount, generally is going to work. But the other option is to buy a polarizer one step bigger. So let's say your lens has a 77 millimeter front or filter ring. You could buy an 82 millimeter polarizer and then get an 82 millimeter to 77 millimeter step down ring. And that's certainly going to eliminate the vignetting where the filter shows up in the corners.
And then do you want to explain the difference between standard thin P sprocket and Z Pro sprocket?
So standard and thin both screw in directly to the front of the lens using the lens's filter threads. The thin mount is the better option in my mind for wide angle lenses. It has less chance. I don't think I've ever, well, using the thin mount, I've never had vignetting where the corners of the frame shows the filter or is darkened because of the filter being there. So certainly for me, I could use a thin mount for all my lenses because I don't screw any other lenses in. I really only use two filters, polarizer and the graduated neutral density. I hand hold the graduated neutral density. So if you're gonna want to screw multiple filters onto each other, then using the regular works, but every filter you add is going to increase the chances of vignetting in the corners. The Z sprockets are designed to go into a filter system as opposed to screwing the filter onto the lens. You're going to screw a filter system adapter onto the lens and then put the filter into the filter system like a Coke and P or a Lee filter system. I don't use those, so I couldn't tell you the difference between a Z sprocket or another type, but they're there to be used in a specific filter holding system like a Coke and P or Coke and Z.
All right. I think that's it for our questions tonight. I want to thank you so much for presenting for us tonight. I want to thank everybody who joined us. Definitely check out Greg's Instagram and Facebook and stay posted there for information about his new book. And we'll get a copy of this recording out to everyone tonight. So thanks again, Greg.
Thanks, Michelle. My pleasure.